Texas, 1879. The roof had been leaking since April. Eliza Howe knew the exact spot, third beam from the east wall, where the shingles had warped in the spring rains and left a gap the size of a man's fist that let in water every time the sky had an opinion about things. She'd put a bucket there in April. The bucket had become furniture by June. By August, she'd stopped seeing it entirely, the way you stop seeing things that have become permanent features of your problem. She was 24 years old and ran the Howe farm alone, which was 40 acres of flat Texas scrubland south of Calver Creek that her father had left her when he died the previous winter. Not because he'd planned it that way. He'd planned to live considerably longer, but because her brother Thomas had gone to California in 1875 and written twice since, and her mother had been gone since Eliza was 9, and there was no one else. The farm was modest. A house, a barn, a chicken coop, 12 acres under cultivation, and a mule named August, who had opinions about everything and shared them freely. The land itself was decent if you worked it, which she did, in the particular way that people work things when the alternative is losing them. She managed. That was the word people in Calver Creek used about her. She manages. It was a compliment, she knew, and also a kind of distance, the town's way of admiring something without getting too close to it. She was in the garden on a Monday morning in September when she heard the hammer. His name was Gideon Cole, and he was nobody's idea of a carpenter. He was 45 years old and owned the property that bordered hers to the north, 200 acres of scrubland and creek bottom that he ran with a small herd of cattle and the help of one ranch hand named Pete, who was 63 and moved accordingly. Gideon had a square jaw and a wide forehead, and the kind of face that outdoor work produces over decades, tanned and lined and entirely itself, without apology. He wore a battered brown cowboy hat that had been through more Texas weather than most men had survived, and he wore it pushed back slightly in the way of a man who uses it for shade rather than style. He had a kizil gray beard he kept short and dark green eyes that were direct without being aggressive, the eyes of someone who has learned to look at things accurately rather than optimistically. He had also, apparently, climbed onto her roof without asking. Eliza came around the side of the house with a basket of beans and stopped, looked up. There was a man on her roof with a hammer and a stack of new shingles, and the focused, unhurried posture of someone doing a job they've done before. "Mr. Cole," she said. He looked down. "Miss Howe, what are you doing on my roof?" He looked at the shingle in his hand, then back at her, with the expression of a man for whom the answer was self-evident. "Fixing it," he said. "I didn't ask you to fix it." "No," he agreed. "You didn't." He went back to the shingle. She stood in the yard with her basket of beans and looked up at him for a moment. "You can't just climb onto a person's roof," she said. "I can, if the person's roof has been leaking since April," he said, without looking down. "Pete told me he saw the bucket through the window when he came to return your father's fence stretcher in May." Eliza considered this. The fence stretcher had been returned in May. She had thanked Pete and gone back to work and not thought about what else he might have noticed. "I'll pay for the shingles," she said. "You won't," he said. "Mr. Cole, Miss Howe." He looked down again, the hammer resting on his knee. "It's 12 shingles and 2 hours of work. Your father was a decent man and a decent neighbor for 20 years. Let me finish." She looked at him. He looked back. The Texas September sun was doing what it always did, which was make everything completely clear and slightly too bright. She went inside and made coffee. He came down at noon. She had the coffee on the table and a plate of cornbread she'd made that morning, and he came into the kitchen without ceremony and sat down and took the coffee the way people take things they need, without making a production of needing them. They had not, she realized, spent more than 3 minutes in the same room before today. He was her neighbor. He had been her father's neighbor for 20 years. She'd seen him at the feed store, and at church at Christmas, and once at the market in Calver Creek, where he'd tipped his hat and kept walking. She knew his name and his property line, and the fact that his wife had died 6 years ago. That was the full extent of what she knew about Gideon Cole. She found herself revising the estimate. "The third beam needs watching," he said. "The shingles will hold through winter, but if it's a wet spring, you'll want to replace the beam before April." "How much would that cost?" she said. He told her. It was less than she'd expected. She said so. "Pete does the lumber runs," he said. "He gets a fair price." She refilled his coffee without asking. He noticed this and said nothing, which she noted. "Your cattle are grazing close to the south fence," she said. "I don't mind, but the third post from the creek is soft. If they push it—" "I'll look at it this week," he said. She nodded. They were quiet for a moment. Through the kitchen window, August, the mule, was visible in the near paddock, watching the barn with the philosophical suspicion of an animal who has decided that barns are not to be trusted. "Your mule has opinions," Gideon said. "About everything," she said. "What's he suspicious of today?" "The barn cat came back," she said. "They have a complicated history. Something happened in his face. Not quite a smile, but the bones of one, the suggestion of a man who might smile if the occasion presented itself clearly enough." She filed this away without entirely meaning to. "He came back on Wednesday, not for the roof. The roof was done. He came to look at the south fence post, the soft one, which he found was softer than he'd expected and required replacing rather than reinforcing. He brought a new post. Pete drove it over in the wagon before Gideon arrived on horseback, which meant Gideon hadn't told Pete to bring the post. He'd arranged it the previous day, before he came to look, because he'd already decided what he'd find. Eliza watched this sequence of events from the garden and thought about a man who solves problems before they announce themselves. She brought water to the fence line at midday, not coffee this time. It was too hot for coffee at midday in September in Texas, and she'd noticed on Monday that he'd drunk the water she set on the porch railing before he'd touched the coffee. He took the water, drank it, looked at her. "You noticed," he said. "I notice things," she said. He nodded, as if this confirmed something. They stood at the fence line in the September heat. The creek was low and brown at this time of year. The cattle on his side were moving slowly the way cattle move when it's too hot to have opinions. "Your father used to come over for supper on Sundays," Gideon said. "After Martha died, he didn't like eating alone." She looked at the creek. "I know. He mentioned it." A pause. "He liked you." "He was easy to like," Gideon said. "The good ones usually are." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the fence post with the same focused attention he gave most things. "He never talked much about his neighbors," she said. "Except you. He said you were a man who did what he said he'd do." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "That's the whole of it, really," he said. "If you do what you say you'll do, you don't need much else." She thought about this. She thought about men she'd known who hadn't done what they said they'd do, which was most of them, in small ways and large ones. She thought about Thomas in California, who had said he'd write and hadn't. She thought about the 3 men in Calver Creek who'd expressed interest in the farm. In the farm, she'd noted, more than in the year since her father died. "No," she said, "you don't." And here, friends, I want to stop for just a moment. These frontier stories reach further than I ever imagined when I started writing them. I know some of you are in Texas yourselves, some in Australia, some in Ireland or Canada or Germany, places this voice travels to that I've never seen. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Leave your country in the comments. Every one of you is someone I'm grateful for. Now let's go back to Eliza, because October is coming, and with it the thing neither of them has said yet. October came the way Texas Octobers do, which is slowly and without much drama, the heat dropping by degrees, the creek coming up slightly, the mornings acquiring a thin, cool edge that hadn't been there in September. Gideon Cole came by on Tuesdays, not always for a reason. Sometimes with a reason, a question about the property line, a tool to return, information about the cattle market in Calver Creek, sometimes without one, arriving in the yard in the late afternoon with his hat pushed back and some observation about the weather, or the creek, or the state of the south pasture. Eliza noticed the Tuesdays. She didn't say anything about them. She also noticed that August the mule had stopped regarding Gideon with suspicion after the third visit and now came to the fence when he heard the horse. This she considered significant in ways she didn't examine too carefully. The town noticed too. Calver Creek was not a large town, and Eliza Howe's farm was not invisible, and Gideon Cole's horse tied to her fence rail on a Tuesday afternoon was not a secret. Ruth Alderman at the dry goods store mentioned it to Eliza with the warmth of a woman who means well and the precision of one who has been paying attention. "I hear Gideon Cole's been helping out over at your place," Ruth said. "He fixed the roof," Eliza said, "and a fence post." "That's neighborly," Ruth said, in a tone that meant something additional. "It is," Eliza said, in a tone that acknowledged the additional meaning without engaging with it. She bought her flour and left. The man who engaged with it directly was Sheriff Dale Pruitt, which she had not expected. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, pleasant-faced in the arranged way of men who have always known they were pleasant-faced, and he had been making his interest in Eliza Howe known since approximately the week after her father's funeral, with the patient confidence of a man who considers himself a strong candidate. He came by the farm on a Thursday in October with what he described as a welfare check and what was visibly a social call. He sat at her kitchen table and drank her coffee and told her about the town council meeting and the new land dispute on the North Road, and eventually, with the practiced ease of someone who has been steering a conversation for 20 minutes, said, "I hear Cole's been spending time over here." "He fixed my roof," she said. "Again." "He's a good man," Dale said, with the generous tone of someone conceding a minor point. "Quiet, keeps to himself." A pause. "A young woman needs more than a quiet neighbor, though. Someone who can offer something." He looked at her directly. He had the confidence of a man who believes this is going well. "I've been thinking about asking if you'd let me call on you properly, Eliza." She looked at him. He was pleasant and prosperous, and the town would approve, and he knew it, and that knowledge was sitting in the room with them like a third person. "I'll think about it," she said, which was kind and honest, and bought her time she wasn't sure what to do with. He left satisfied, which was his natural condition, and Eliza stood at the kitchen window afterward and looked at the yard and thought about a man who'd climbed onto her roof without asking and fixed it without being thanked and come back twice more for reasons that were becoming less and less about fence posts. She was still at the window when Gideon rode into the yard on his Tuesday. He came to the kitchen door because he always did now, not the front door. She opened it before he knocked. "Sheriff Pruitt came by Thursday," she said. He stopped on the step, looked at her. Did he? "He wants to call on me properly." Something moved in Gideon's green eyes. Not jealousy exactly, the more considered expression of a man receiving information that requires a response he hasn't prepared. "And?" he said. "I told him I'd think about it." She leaned against the door frame. "He said a young woman needs more than a quiet neighbor." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He had the capacity for silence that certain men develop, not empty silence, but the kind that means something is being thought through. "He's not wrong," he said finally. "He said it about you," she said. "I know what he meant," Gideon said. He looked at his hat brim. "He's 32 years old, and he's the sheriff, and he has a good house in town. Those are reasonable things." "They are," she said. "I'm 45 years old, and I have a cattle operation and a ranch hand who is 63 and moves like it," he said. "Those are also things." She looked at him. In the paddock, August had come to the fence and was watching Gideon with the frank attention of an animal who has decided where he stands. "He said, 'A sheriff would steal my heart,'" she said. Gideon looked at her. The October afternoon light was on his face, the lines around his eyes, the gray coming through the red of his beard, the battered hat pushed back the way it always was. "And?" he said. She almost smiled. The almost was doing a lot of work. I told him I'd rather it be the man who fixed my roof, she said. The yard was very quiet. The creek was running somewhere below the south pasture. August stood at the fence with the self-satisfied expression of a mule whose opinion has been vindicated. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with the plain directness she'd come to expect from him, "Eliza, are you telling me something?" "I'm telling you something," she said. He nodded, once, slowly, the way he did everything that mattered. "Then I have something to tell you too," he said, "if you'll let me come in." She stepped aside. He came in. He sat at the table where he'd sat on the Monday in September, when she'd made coffee after he fixed the roof. He put his hat on the table beside him, which he'd never done before, and she noticed the hat on the table and understood that this was a different kind of visit than the others. She sat across from him, waited. "I have been finding reasons to come over here since September," he said. "You know that." "I know," she said. "The fence post needed doing," he said. "That was real. The rest—" He stopped. He looked at his hat. "The rest was me finding out whether the thing I thought I was finding out was actually true." "And?" she said. "It is," he said. He looked up at her, the green eyes direct, the way they always were. "I'm not a young man, and I'm not the sheriff, and I don't have much by way of eloquence, but I have the farm next door, and 40 years of knowing how to mean what I say." He paused. "I'd like to come calling on you properly, if you'll allow it." The kitchen was quiet. October light through the window, the mule audible in the paddock, the particular stillness of a moment that has been approaching for several weeks and has finally arrived. "You fixed my roof without being asked," she said. "Yes. You brought a new fence post before you even looked at the old one, because you already knew what you'd find." "Yes. You remembered I don't like coffee at midday." He looked at her steadily. "I remember everything," he said, simply, the way he said everything that was true. She pressed her hands flat on the table, looked at them, then at him. "You can come calling, Gideon Cole," she said. "You already have been, if we're being honest about it." Something happened to his face then. The bones of the smile she'd been watching for since September finally arranged themselves into the actual thing. It was, she thought, entirely worth waiting for. November came, and they didn't hide it. This was partly because there was nothing to hide. He came on Tuesdays and Thursdays now, openly, tying his horse at the front fence because that was what calling on someone properly looked like, and Eliza opened the door when she saw him coming because that was what allowing someone to call on you properly looked like. It was partly also because Eliza Howe was not a woman who hid things. She ran her farm and her life with the same directness, and if Gideon Cole's horse was at her fence on a Thursday afternoon, she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The town had opinions. The town always had opinions. Ruth Alderman thought it was wonderful and said so to everyone. Reverend Miles thought the age difference was notable and said so to Gideon directly, which Gideon received without argument. "She's 24, the Reverend said. "You're 45. "I'm aware," Gideon said. "In 20 years. "In 20 years, Gideon said. "I'll be 65. And she'll have had 20 years of a man who means what he says and fixes what's broken and doesn't find reasons to be elsewhere when the work is hard." He looked at the Reverend. "I think that's worth something." The Reverend thought about this for a moment. Then he nodded once and said nothing further. Sheriff Dale Pruitt was gracious about it, which surprised Eliza and elevated her opinion of him. He tipped his hat to Gideon at the feed store and moved on with the composure of a man who has assessed the situation and made peace with the arithmetic. Within the month, he was paying attention to the banker's daughter from the next town, which suited everyone. The Thursday in November when things became certain was an ordinary Thursday in most respects. Eliza had been in the south field mending a section of fence that had come down in the wind. It was the kind of work that takes longer alone than it should, holding the wire taut, while also trying to fasten it being a task designed for two people. She'd been at it for an hour when she heard hooves and looked up, and it was Gideon, not on Tuesday, on a Thursday, which she noted. He dismounted without speaking, took the wire from her hands, and held it while she fastened it. They worked the rest of the section together without discussing who would do what, in the easy division of labor that develops between people who have been paying attention to each other. When they were done, he coiled the remaining wire while she gathered her tools. "You came on a Thursday," she said. "I did," he said. "That's not your day." "I know." He put the wire down. He looked at her across the fence post, the brown cowboy hat, the kizil gray beard, the green eyes entirely serious. "I've been thinking about something, and I decided Thursday was a better day to say it than Tuesday." She waited. "I'm not good at long speeches," he said. "You know that." "I know," she said. "So I'll say it short." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, a simple gold band, plain and honest, the way he was plain and honest. "I'd like you to marry me, Eliza Howe. I'd like you to have the farm next door and the cattle operation, and Pete, who is slow but reliable, and the 20 years I have left in me to work hard for something worth working for." He paused. "I'm not young, but I'm not going anywhere either." She looked at the ring, then at him, at the hat and the beard and the green eyes and the man who had climbed onto her roof in September without asking because the roof needed fixing and he'd noticed. "You fixed my roof," she said. "I did," he said. "You could have just told me it was leaking." "I could have," he agreed, "but it needed fixing." She thought about that, about a man whose instinct for a problem was not to point at it, but to fix it, about 20 years of that, the reliable, quiet, daily fact of it. "Yes," she said, "Gideon Cole." He put the ring on her finger there at the south fence line, in the November afternoon, with the creek running brown and low behind them, and August watching from the paddock with the expression of an animal whose judgment has been confirmed. "The mule approves," Gideon said. "He's been approving of you since October," she said. "I thought you knew." "I knew," he said. "I was waiting for you to catch up." She looked at him with the expression that had been building since September, the one that was warm and direct and completely undefended. "I caught up some time ago," she said. "I was waiting for you to say something." He almost laughed. "We wasted some time," he said. "We did," she agreed. "But we have time left." He took her hand. They walked back toward the house in the November afternoon, August trailing along the fence line beside them with great importance, as though he had personally arranged the whole thing and was satisfied with the outcome. What would you have done in Eliza's place? The sheriff was offering something easy and obvious and approved of. Gideon was offering something quieter and less certain on the surface. Would you have known the difference? I think about that question. The obvious choice and the right choice don't always look the same from the outside, but from the inside, she always knew. She knew it when he came down off the roof and drank the coffee without making her feel that she owed him for it. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. They were married in December on a Saturday in the Calver Creek Church. It was a cold, clear morning, the kind Texas produces in December. Not Montana cold, not Wyoming brutal, but honest enough, the kind that makes the air sharp and the light brilliant and everything look exactly as it is. Eliza wore a dress the color of sage, deep and quiet, because she was not a woman who wore things she hadn't chosen for herself. She came down the aisle with her hand on Pete's arm, because Pete was 63 and slow and had driven the fence post over in September, and this seemed like the right acknowledgement of that. Pete cried, which no one had expected, least of all Pete. Gideon stood at the altar without his hat, which was the only time anyone in Calver Creek had seen him without it, and he watched her come toward him with the expression of a man who has assessed something accurately and is grateful for the accuracy. Ruth Alderman sat in the second pew and had opinions about everything and kept them to herself for once, which was its own kind of gift. The Reverend kept it short, because Gideon had asked him to, because neither of them had any patience for long speeches, and the vows were what mattered. After, in the December afternoon, they stood on the church steps, and Eliza looked at the flat Texas scrubland and the wide sky, and the road that ran south toward her farm and north toward his. "One of them has to go," she said. "One farm," he said. "Yes? Which one?" He considered it with the seriousness he gave practical questions. "Yours has the better kitchen," he said. "Yours has more land," she said. "We'll run both," he said, "for now, and see." She nodded. This was how he approached everything, not with a fixed plan, but with a direction and the willingness to work it out as they went. She had come to trust this about him, the way you trust a fence that's been built right, not because it looks impressive, but because it holds. Spring came and the roof held. Gideon had replaced the third beam in March, the one he'd flagged in September, the one she'd have needed to deal with before April. He'd done it on a Tuesday while she was in the south field, and she'd come back to find it done, the way she'd come back in September to find the shingles replaced and a man coming down her ladder with a hammer. She'd stood in the yard and looked up at the roof, and then she'd gone inside and made coffee, the same as she had the first time. He came in at noon, sat at the table. She put the coffee in front of him. "The beam," she said. "Done," he said. "You could have told me you were going to do it," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "Why didn't you?" He looked at his coffee, then at her, the green eyes entirely honest, the way they always were. "Because then you'd have argued about paying for the timber," he said. "This way it's done, and the argument has no practical application." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down across from him at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd sat in September when she made the first coffee, and she thought about all the Tuesdays since then, and the fence post, and the south field, and the ring at the fence line in November. "Gideon Cole," she said. "Yes," he said. "You're going to spend the rest of your life fixing things before I know they're broken." He picked up his coffee. The hint of the smile, the one that had taken until September to show itself, and now arrived somewhat more readily. "Most likely," he said. She looked at the ceiling, at the repaired beam, at the roof that held, then back at him. "Good," she said. And the Texas spring came through the kitchen window, warm and bright, and the farm was full of the sound of two people's lives, and the mule in the paddock with his opinions, and it was by every honest measure entirely enough. Gideon Cole was not the obvious choice. He was not young or eloquent or the kind of man who makes a strong first impression. He was the kind of man who climbs onto a neighbor's roof without asking, because it needs fixing, and that is a different thing entirely. Quieter, less visible, and considerably more rare. Eliza knew the difference because she was the kind of woman who pays attention to what people do, rather than what they say about what they do. Those two found each other at a fence line in September, and everything else was just time. If this story gave you something warm tonight, please like and subscribe. These frontier romances exist because of you, and I am grateful for every one of you who rides along. Wherever you are in the world, until next time, keep riding.